My name is Stephen Lott. I'm the Senior Lead of Communications for the McMaster Health Forum. I'd like to welcome everybody today to the webinar on decisions informed by best evidence for responding to societal challenges, which is part of Africa Evidence Week. We're really excited to be part of this, and I'm just going to kick it right over to our speakers. So Ruth Stewart is going to say a few words to start and then pass things off to Jeremy Grimshaw.
Stephen, thank you very much for the warm welcome, and welcome everybody to Africa Evidence Week 2021. I just want to wind you back slightly to December 2012, when 23 of us as individual colleagues from Africa who are interested in evidence, I think the only way to describe it is that we blagged our way into an Asian evidence conference. We weren't supposed to be there. We all wrote our own kind of begging letters, as made our case as to why we should be there. And at the end of that event, we agreed to keep in touch. And that was the start of the Africa Evidence Network. And fast forward nearly 10 years now, and there's over 3,500 people across the continent committed to supporting evidence use as members of the Evidence Network. And it's extraordinary to me and an amazing pleasure that we're able to welcome the Global Evidence Commission to Africa for this presentation. And even more exciting that the Commission itself includes a number of African leaders, and really excited that two of them are able to join us today for this session. So I think that's enough from me. Welcome, thank you for being here, and let me pass across to Jeremy and the other panelists. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ruth. Steve, could you advance to the next slide? Whoop, I know, the one with just the 4 speakers. That's it, thank you. So my name is Jeremy Grimshaw. I'm a senior scientist in the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute in Canada, and I'm one of the co-leads of COVID and the Evidence Commission Secretariat. We're really delighted to have this opportunity to present at the Africa Evidence Week, and really thank Ruth and colleagues for allowing us to do this. This is the first time we have made a formal presentation on the Global Commission anywhere in the world, and it's just wonderful that we can do it today. So I'm going to briefly introduce the commissioners, make a few opening remarks to position this, and then John will sort of take the baton from me, and throughout this we'll be engaging with Fitsum and Mo and asking them to, give us their reflections on where we're at. Just to give you very brief introductions, John Lavis is a professor at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada, the lead of the McMaster Health Forum, and the co-lead of COVID-End and the co-lead of the Evidence Commission Secretariat. We're the kind of the backroom people for the Commission, but we're really delighted that we have two African colleagues who are commissioners. The first is Fitsum, and she serves as a minister in charge of Planning and Development Commission of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. She's a committed policymaker striving to bring a whole of government perspective to cabinet level planning and development. There are full bios of Fitsum and Mo on the Evidence Commission website, so I'm not going to say much more about that. I'll also say that Fitsum is actually stealing time from another really important meeting to be here, and it's likely sometime during the next or this period she'll have to drop out to go back to that meeting, but we're really delighted that she's able to be with us for some time. And then the next commissioner is Mo, and Mo is the managing director of the Evidence Partnership TEP Center, which is Nigeria's pioneering education partnership organization. She is a recognized policy expert specializing in public-private partnerships in education, and also at the moment, particularly is pioneering the use of citizen-led assessments and public-private partnerships to improve education outcomes from children. So hopefully you already get an idea that the Commission has some outstanding individuals helping us with this. Steve, next slide, please. So this is what we want to do. We want to sort of basically, first of all, introduce the Global Commission to sort of, think about why now and what are we trying to achieve with this. Then do a deeper dive on this think about some of the existing weaknesses are in the existing evidence ecosystem, and also what became apparent during the stress test of the COVID-19 evidence response, thinking about how decision makers use evidence, and how we can actually sort of think about a future where we better align the needs of the decision makers with the evidence community. So we're meeting the needs of those people at different levels who are making important decisions. Next slide, Steve. So why the commission and why now? So one of the things that we've observed is the pandemic has probably created has created a once in a generation focus on evidence among governments, businesses, and NGOs, professionals and citizens. We've never seen the level of interest where societies are trying to make sense of what's the research evidence, what does it tell us, how does that help protect citizens and our societies. And we also, as we've done that, identified that whilst there's been a huge amount of really positive innovation during the pandemic about how do we actually provide information rapidly to different decision makers, there's also been a lot of duplication of effort. There's a lot of groups that are repeating work that's already been done. There's a lot of focus on rapid reviews when actually what we probably need are more regularly updated reviews where whenever each of it's getting produced, they get incorporated reviews. So decision makers wherever they are in the world will have the most up-to-date evidence at any point in time, and various other weaknesses. So we've seen innovation, but also some weaknesses in the evidence ecosystem. And it did feel to us that there's a lot to learn in terms of what has happened during the pandemic and what that might suggest about how we might do better as we pass through the pandemic, and we're dealing with the day-to-day decisions that Fitsum, for example, as a minister is dealing with, the slow burn issues of global consequence like antimicrobial resistance or climate change, and also whatever the next global crisis will be. So from our perspective, this seemed like a good time to take stock and try and think about how we could do better to meet the needs of decision makers in the future. So that was, I think, what propelled the Global Commission Secretariat. But I wanted to maybe just ask maybe Fitsum and then Mo, when we approached you, what did you think about this, and why did you agree to get involved? What did what was the hook or the interest from your perspective? Fitsum, do you want to maybe go next?
Sure, very excellent question. When I joined the commission, that the Planning and Development Commission, I mean, when as a minister in charge, the first question was, because I'm coming from the academics, the first question was, how do we do our plans? How do we decide? How do we, because we are supposed to serve as the the knowledge arm of the government, advising on policy decisions, this and that. But the things that I got there are were not that much encouraging. But the good thing was there is this change in the government and this departure where the government was open to listen to, evidences, people in the academia, people who are really authorities and experts in, the areas that we are really dwelling with. So, so that departure in the government gave me the energy really to work toward this, creating that knowledge, that evidence base, which really would help us to do quality decisions. Then I heard about this evidence commission. So it perfectly aligned with what I really wanted to do in my office and as a government as well, because I'm coordinating the whole government in doing planning and in monitoring and evaluation. It really needs evidences. Yes, so that's how I got interested in the evidence commission. Yeah,
wonderful. And just to clarify for people on the call, I didn't mention this, but it is in your bio that in Ethiopia, you're actually heading up a commission on planning and development. So we need to be careful about which commission we're talking about.
Yes, yes.
But
Yeah.
I'll think about that. Mo, what was the initial reason why, when we reached out to you, you kind of thought this was interesting and might be sort of helpful for you?
Great. Thanks, Jeremy, and hello, everyone. So for me, in the space that I work in, I find that the provision of evidence, the generation of evidence, the provision of evidence is not prioritized as highly, as it really should be. I think for me, the real attraction was my reflection on the 2017 Nigerian Education Innovation Summit, which we hosted. We host this innovation summit every year. And the theme for that year was evidence to action. And so how do we strengthen policymaking and also practice through the generation of evidence? And a number of themes emerged there, in terms of generating evidence, the shift from data to evidence, the need for increased rigor, the need to begin to think very deeply about technology. Remember, this was 2017, way ahead of the pandemic. And also the need for multi-stakeholder engagement. But we also realized at that point that the missing link a lot of times was strategic communication and thinking of the provision of evidence within the lens of how do you communicate this evidence. And so thinking about strategic approaches for communicating evidence, thinking about cross-sectoral learnings and sharing those, and also the affordability and access to information about what is evidence. And so when I received the invitation, for me, it was a no-brainer. And this is an area that I'm passionate about and I work in every single day. And I'm excited to be a commissioner here.
That's wonderful. Thank you both. I'm going to keep on with the slide deck, and then there'll be other kind of questions and opportunities to engage you. And then at the end, we'll also have a period of questions for the participants. Next slide, Steve. So you've heard the why, and to some extent we were stimulated by COVID. But if you listen to Fitsum and Mo, there are already sort of underlying sort of interests in this and their different sectors. What we would like to do is think about a world where decision makers are provided in a timely way with the best evidence, so they can more effectively respond to societal challenges. And we give a number of examples about what that might look like. So citizen groups might be rely on evidence syntheses to fact check statements made by their governments and to advocate for change, for example. We'd like the evidence producers to be supported by improved prioritization and coordination processes and other supports, so they can work in their areas of strength and build on one another's needs and really address those needs of decision makers. Often the sort of evidence production side is a bit fragile from funding across the world, and people are often sort of trying to do things with relatively little resources, given the importance of the task. And also we hope that those intermediaries that often work between the evidence producers and decision makers, governments or other organizations, have positioned often have the right capabilities, so they can package the right evidence on the right issues at the right time in the right context. So next slide, Steve. When we started to think about the Commission, what we wanted to do is make sure that it was truly global, and it also was intersectoral. I come from a health background, but as Mo has just highlighted, these evidence issues are exactly the same in an education setting. As Fitsum has said, in terms of the sort of more macro development and planning for a country, they're exactly the same there. So we wanted to make sure we were global, we were intersectoral, and also we had a range of experience and expertise within the group. So we now have 23 commissioners, and they really do span a broad range of areas. They span a spectrum of experience and seniority. We have gender balance. There's a very broad ethno-racial sort of mix, and we have representatives from 6 world regions, 10 of the most populous countries, and also for the 6 most widely spoken languages in the world. So we were going for this sort of broad sweep. Next slide, Steve. And this is our wonderful commission, and you've met Mo and you've met Fitsum. But we also, for example, have Donna May Knight, who's from the Caribbean and is a career public servant who really is focused on poverty reduction and developing policy change towards building sustainable communities. Jan Minks from Germany, who is one of the people involved in the Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change. We have Petra Karachi from Indonesia, who is a data analytic person providing support to governments there. So you can see a broad range of people. We have Hadika Bashir, who's a young leader from Pakistan, who's advocating for girls' rights, gender equality. And also, just to identify another person, Ibera Alves de Silva, who is a Brazilian, an indigenous Brazilian, who's really helping us think about how we incorporate indigenous knowledge also into these knowledge and evidence systems that decision makers need. So it's a very broad base of individuals. At the end of the presentation, we'll give you our website, and you can go to the website and basically look who's there and get more information on anybody. Next slide, please, Steve. So we've talked about the Global Commission Secretariat, and it's based in Canada at McMaster. This is an initiative that's come out of something called COVIDend, and COVIDend is basically an umbrella organization of it's actually now 58 of the major evidence synthesis producers, guidance producers, evidence intermediaries, trying to support decision makers during the pandemic. And we have some examples there. So the African Centre for Evidence is one of our partners, as is Campbell, Cochrane, Guidelines International, and Evidence Synthesis International. Next slide. And this is just the breadth of partners we have. And from Africa in particular, we have ACRES, the Centre for Rapid Evidence Synthesis, at Makerere, the African Centre for Evidence, the African Evidence Network, the Centre for Evidence-Based Healthcare, Cochrane South Africa, eBase, Makerere University, the MLC in South Africa, and I'm probably missing one or two, and I apologize for that. But we've actually from day one had just amazing sort of input and support and energy from our colleagues in Africa. And next slide, please, Steve. So I've introduced John and myself, and you'll hear from John very shortly. The other key person in this is Jen Thornhill-Verma, who's on the line, but is also packing for a trip just now, so she's probably not going to actually come on and say hello. But really, I would say it's John and Jen who've been leading this, and then we're supported by an amazing team of people who make so many different contributions, and they're just on the slide there. I'm not going to go through them all, but we couldn't do this without their very active support. And next slide, Steve. So this is just to give you an idea about the timeline. One of the things in the pandemic is that we've learned to try and do things fast. So we started this in July, and we hope to have the commission report available by the end of this year. And it'll be produced in the six official languages of the WHO. But it doesn't end there. Producing the report doesn't do anything if it's not acted upon. So what we then see is working with the commissioners, working with the COVIDend partners, and anybody else who's interested in this, we can then, over the next 12, 18, 24 months, think about how we influence agendas, both at a global level, jurisdictional level, within sectors, to allow people to start to have conversations about how do we better align the evidence production and synthesis world with the decision-making world, so that we can help decision makers use best evidence. And I'm going to now hand over to John Lavis, my colleague. John, I don't know if you want to say anything else in terms of introduction to yourself, or whether you just want to take over.
Well, I'll just say, Steve, if we could just go to the next slide, but I'll just say it's great to be home again in my second home. I have the good fortune to be a visiting professor at the Africa Center for Evidence, which acts as a convener for the Africa Evidence Network. So it's a delight to be reconnecting with colleagues in Africa, including at the Africa Center for Evidence. I'm going to turn it over to Fitsum and Mo in a minute, just to ask them if they would be willing to talk a little bit about how they think about using evidence in their role. But first, I'll just introduce a few slides to give you the context in which they may be responding to that. One is just about how the Commission builds on and complements past work. So we want to make sure that we speak to the full array of types of decision makers. So you'll shortly hear from a government policymaker in Fitsum, a non-governmental organizational leader in Mo. We also want to, though, speak to professionals, engineers, teachers, nurses, and so on. And we also want to speak directly to citizens who themselves, of course, make terribly important decisions and can be an input into decision-making by others. We want to talk about many forms of evidence. So I think in the past, we've all spoken to the forms of evidence with which we're more familiar, evidence syntheses or data analytics, but they all add value in different ways to decision making. And ideally, we need to be coming together with these different forms when they are appropriate to answering a particular question. And we also feel that there's a lot of shared issues, but also unique issues as we look across societal challenges. So I've learned a lot in the last 4 months about how differently people in the climate action world think about evidence compared to us and in the health field. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. And I hope that we will have an opportunity, they will have an opportunity to learn from us as well. Steve, if we could go to the next slide. As I mentioned before, the Evidence Commission really wants to speak to all of these categories of decision makers. And today with Fitsum, you'll have a chance to hear from a cabinet minister, a type of government policymaker. And government policymakers have to make decisions in their own right, but they also set the context in which other individuals in society make decisions. So there's two roles: as a decision maker, but also as a supporter of other groups in society in their decision making. NGO leaders like Mo, again, they make decisions in their own right, but one of Mo's many interesting roles is playing up to and trying to inform government policymaking, but also trying to support the leaders of educational institutions, teachers, to be making more informed decisions, and also helping parents to make informed decisions about educational choices that their children may be facing. And then, as I mentioned before, we also want to speak to professionals and citizens, but today we have commissioners representing those first two categories. On to the next slide. And I alluded to this a bit before, but we've really come to realize that the different forms of evidence are encountered by decision makers. And so this is not a typology of types of research. It's more that if you're a decision maker, you may get evidence in the form of data analytics. You may get it in the form of an evaluation report. You may get it in the form of an evidence synthesis. Different forms of evidence help to answer different types of questions. But in the past, these forms have been very isolated, and I think we can do a much better job in bringing them together when they help to address a similar question. One of the most interesting things that I've heard our two commissioners speak about in the case of Fitsum is the work she's been leading in Ethiopia on developing a multidimensional poverty index, which is going to be hugely helpful in Ethiopia in the future. It will allow better data analytics. It can be used in modeling. It can be used in evaluation. Those studies can then be synthesized in the form of an evidence synthesis. So Fitsum, through her work with the multi-generational poverty index, is laying the groundwork for many forms of evidence that will emerge from the use of that index. Mo, on the other hand, and Mo, you should correct me if I get this wrong in the wording, but I think of Mo being in part a champion for the use of citizen assessments. And again, that is creating a platform that in future, can be used by data analysts, modelers, evaluators, evidence synthesizers, so that we're using data collected by citizens themselves or using assessments from citizens themselves. And then we'll just go to the final slide, which is about challenges. If we could jump to the next one, it's a two-part slide, but you can look at challenges in many ways, by the level or sector at which a challenge is typically addressed, by the reason why we choose to label a challenge a problem worth paying attention to, and by the complexity of the underlying problem. The next slide, Steve, if we just go to it, it's a bit busy, but again, we have Mo here, who is primarily focused on what we would put in that top left corner, domestic sectoral policy challenges or decision challenges. So she's focused on the Nigerian education sector. Mo, on the other hand, plays this, Fitsum, on the other hand, plays this really interesting whole of government role through the Planning and Development Commission. So she's an example of someone working in the space of a domestic cross-sectoral focus. So that's just a bit of a lens for how the Evidence Commission is starting to think about different types of decision makers, different forms of evidence, and different ways of looking at challenges. So Fitsum, could I turn it over to you, and then we'll go to Mo. So you, Fitsum, could you just talk a little bit about how you see your role in using evidence and supporting the use of evidence?
Sure, I definitely I can yes, reflect on that. Using evidence of any form, depending on the type of policy decision or the type of agenda on the table, really is important because one, it will make you do the right intervention. For instance, you mentioned about the multidimensional poverty indicator. So for that, one of the big homework that we have as Ethiopia for the government and other stakeholders is reduction of poverty, and poverty in all its dimensions, at least in most of the dimensions that are considered drivers and binding constraints, yes? So in that case, we'll be using the evidence that we, produced through the modeling and, data should be converted into evidence, as my friend Mo said earlier. So that evidence, the multidimensional, so where are we in terms of, for instance, access to education? How far is the primary education center, for instance, from a given household? That's one thing. How far is, a clinic, which gives maternal health care in a given rural setting? So such kind of evidences give us, the right information so that we do proper interventions at macro level, do proper investments, of course. For instance, we have again another initiative, we call it Warada transformation. I don't know if you are familiar with the type of government structure in Ethiopia. So we have, this is the lowest level of government structure, the Warada. It's kind of county, you can call it county. So now we are now having multi-sectoral, multi-sectoral kind of, I can call it committee, a steering team. We have people from logistics, the minister from logistics and transport, health, education, agriculture, water and energy. So now we sit together and plan for that specific Warada and identify the areas where we need the right intervention. If all sectors were going on a silo basis, they will just do maybe the wrong investment. For instance, unless there is energy and electricity, unless there is maybe water, there is no use in building a hospital or a clinic. So you first need to work on the other enabling things, the energy, the road, and other facilities. So we are also working on that. So evidence has been so instrumental. But we have a lot still to fill as gap or lots of potential for improvement, but we are really heading on the right direction in terms of using evidence for the right, for decision of the right investment, for deciding on the right intervention. But at the same time, it's not only at government level. Such evidences help to really advise our farmers, for instance, on the right decisions and or the right choices they have to make. Maybe about using technologies, about using fertilizers, about cropping patterns and this and that. So evidences are really important, and we're trying to really base our decision on evidences and advise, of course, citizens as well. Again, we have, for instance, another issue on the table: inflation, a macro problem at the moment. Previously, when we think about inflation and the way we used to decide was just to solve, fighting a fire, decide just on the things that we have at hand, like deciding to minimize the money supply, maybe do some controls here and there, running around the markets and do, some regulatory works. But now we wanted to have a full picture, understanding the drivers of inflation in Ethiopian context, so that we do the right sustainable intervention. And in that case, because our previous decisions, policy decisions, really came with unintended consequences. Inflation was still there, but again, there are other unintended consequences. So we really finally decided to have a comprehensive, rigorous study to understand the drivers and to act accordingly. So now we are working on such things as well. And there are lots of things on environment, climate change issues. We didn't know how to really incorporate, for instance, environment and climate change related concerns in our planning. What we did was we collaborated with another institution. It's kind of a research institute, global research institute, to really understand what does it mean to mainstream climate change and environment related issues in our plan. How do we account for it? And of course, for politicians and governments, they really need to see economic justifications to act, in environmentally friendly way, to really invest to, issues that really for adaptation and mitigation of climate change. Yes, it really needs economic justification, and for that we really resorted to such evidences, a research, a rigorous study, which really gives us the evidence that if we act in an environmentally friendly way, if we really incorporate the climate change related issues in our plan, in the long run we'll definitely benefit from it. So that's how we are really trying to use evidences for our decisions. So again, I would have really loved to stay, but as I've mentioned earlier, I have another meeting going on. That's next room.
Yep.
So
well, thank you very, very much, Fitsum, for joining us. We're very grateful that you quickly left the other meeting to join us temporarily. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next commissioner meeting.
Yes,
thank
see you soon. Bye.
Thanks.
All.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It's funny, I sometimes feel our job is complicated, where we're trying to help people to figure out how to organize the health system in a way that gets the right programs, services, and products to the people who need them. But when I hear Fitsum talking about dealing with poverty and inflation and climate action and supporting farmers to make decisions, I realize how our world is remarkably circumscribed, and she's dealing with these big, complex, and at times what some people have called wicked problems. Mo, you also work in a very complex environment in the Nigerian education sector. Could you talk a little bit about how you see your role in using and supporting the use of evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for that question. And so just by way of a background, the country where I come from, Nigeria, is home to almost 200 million people. So quite, populous. And within, that large population is incredible amounts of diversity. 250 ethnicities, up to 500 languages, 36 states. It's huge. And so because there's this amount of diversity, and in many instances, a lack of cohesion, a lack of social cohesion across the country, what happens is that data becomes very sensational. And part of my mission is really to move beyond the sensationalism and the rhetoric of data into good evidence. So typical examples in the country as at today, we don't have one standardized assessment that tells us what children can do before they hit grade 9. And so this has been the result of what some people refer to as policy somersaults, over the years. We did used to have, key stage examinations, and some of them were scrapped for different reasons. But the point is, we don't have one single standardized examination or assessment that tells us what children can do before they hit the age of 15. And so if we're beginning to measure that at the age of 15, and we discover that there are significant issues in their learning, how really does one begin to remediate at that point? And that's what really prompted, the work that we do in Learn Nigeria. It was really important that we could, first of all, produce data and then create evidence that could help, first of all, in highlighting what the real situation was. How really are our children learning, at foundational levels? And this has really never been done, in the country. And then moving upward to say, how are they learning as they go higher, before they get to grade 9? And so this evidence for us is critical for policy advocacy and thinking about what sort of policies make sense, for the education sector and what should we be prioritizing. But it's not just about policy, it's also about action as well. And so in terms of professional practice, in terms of teacher training and development, in terms of in-service training for teachers, what does this evidence portend for how teachers should be developed, in the Nigerian context? What does it say about the sorts of classrooms that we should be constructing and the kind of learning spaces and opportunities that we ought to be creating for children? And of course, what sort of remediation, should we be providing to children who have been left behind? So I guess in a nutshell, it's really for me, I suppose, a mission, to make the appreciation and the use of evidence, cultural, across the country, not just at policy level, but also and critically at the level of the citizen as well, who is a most important member of the decision-making process in a democracy.
Interesting. And Mo, can I just ask you, if my memory is right, you also have done a lot of work in the past on public-private partnerships. And does your work also take you into the private sector where you're dealing with private sector educational institutions and so on?
Oh, absolutely. We work very closely with governments, we work closely with civil society organizations, and we also work closely with the private sector. In fact, we have a unit within the organization where I work, which is focusing exclusively on education investments. And this is helping corporations become more knowledgeable about education and to become more responsible when it comes to allocating resources via their corporate social responsibility, particularly, to the education sector. So again, it's that thing about moving beyond the rhetoric, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The thing about moving beyond, oh dear, children are not in school, and therefore we need to build more classrooms. Well, there are lots of things you need to do before you build more classrooms, mm-hmm. because if you build the classrooms, they still won't come, mm-hmm. right? It's about being more intelligent about how we use the information that is being provided to us. And what we find, when we work in the PPP space, is that collaboration, and that's a theme that you're probably going to hear me talk about quite a lot today, collaboration is absolutely vital. Success comes when we bring the different perspectives, not unlike what we're doing, on this Global Commission. And when we bring the different perspectives, representing the different interests, and we all sit around the table and have constructive discussion. Then we move forward with an agreement that represents our consensus. And that's when we really begin to see traction. And so PPPs for us are extremely important.
Very, very helpful. Thank you very much, Mo. So Steve, if we could move on to the next slide, and I'm just going to again introduce some slides, and then I'm going to turn it back to Mo to see if she'd be willing to talk a little bit about what she sees as the strengths and the opportunities for improvement in the evidence support system available to her. So someone working as an NGO leader focused on education, what are the pieces of the evidence support system that are working well? How could it be improved? She herself is trying to strengthen that support system, but what are the other pieces of the system that she would need to be working well in order to be primed even better for success? But quickly, I'll just update you on the report. So the report is built around key exhibits that we hope will build the momentum for action. So we're very focused on trying to come up with visually interesting exhibits. An exhibit could be an infographic, a text box, something else, a flow chart that bring alive the concepts that we're talking about. Some of our draft exhibits are already in that more visually interesting form. Others are being put into it in the coming weeks. So if you go to our website, some of them are that more visually compelling, others will get there. And if you have thoughts for us about how we can better communicate in a visually interesting way the key insights from the commission, please let us know. So on to the next slide, which is a bit overwhelming, so brace yourself, but it is the detail on the exhibits. What we're doing with the commissioners is bringing to them waves of exhibits and getting their feedback while we also advance our thinking about the types of recommendations that the commissioners would like to make. The ones in green were first brought to them back in July. The ones in blue were brought to them, the ones in blue were brought to them, gosh, now I'm confused. It should say this month. But anyway, the ones in orange are coming to the commissioners this Friday. The ones in red, we have early drafts, but they're not quite there. But we're committed to try to get these up on our website for public feedback so that if any of you have time to go to our website, see a topic that you're particularly passionate about, like global public goods, like living evidence products, and you have feedback for us, please do send it in. On to the next slide. So here, and there's a lot of text on these slides, but remember, my question to Mo is, what's working well and what could be improved in the evidence support system available in her case for education, decision-making in Nigeria, but for all of you, what's going well and what's going poorly? So this is an example of an exhibit that the first column builds on work done by Philippe Ravaud and his colleagues who are part of Cochrane France. They, before COVID-19, identified a bunch of challenges in the evidence support system or evidence ecosystem. What we've then done is say, well, what are examples of weaknesses that have become more apparent through the COVID-19 evidence response, but also what are efforts to address weaknesses that have emerged? Because as many of you may have heard me say before, in my 25 years of supporting the use of evidence in decision-making, I have never seen such demand for evidence as I saw during COVID-19. But some of those responses, to me, helped me identify weaknesses that may have existed before or they may have emerged. But other times, the global community and domestic evidence communities often responded in very creative ways, in ways that we should be systematizing going forward. So I won't go through the details here. I'll just stay in the left column to note some of the challenges that remain. The lack of global coordination of evidence communities to enhance coordination, avoid duplication. The second, the lack of focus on maintaining living evidence syntheses. So many of the questions that we are asked are questions that come up time and time again, and we shouldn't be commissioning rapid syntheses each time. We should be able to turn to a living evidence synthesis that is kept updated as the science evolves. If we go to the next slide, a third weakness in the system, the lack of focus on identifying harm. So when we have studies of the effects of interventions, we are very focused on potential benefits, but we don't do a very good job of studying harms. The fourth challenge that Philippe Revaux and colleagues identified was the lack of sharing of individual participant data in an anonymized way, so that you can over time get a much better sense of what works for whom in what context, as opposed to just focusing on the overall finding of effectiveness. The next one is the lack of inclusion of representatives from all relevant evidence groups, all relevant types of decision makers, and all relevant types of evidence intermediaries. So if we want to build evidence that helps us understand equity considerations, we need to work with groups that have historically not been part of the conversation, involve them in creating and sharing the evidence, and support them in using the evidence. So as evidence communities, we need to be much more inclusive of very diverse groups of people. Another challenge was the lack of use of new approaches that can help us to be more efficient and timely in our work. Machine learning is having a big effect in many spaces. It has not yet had as much impact in the evidence world as it could perhaps have. And then on to what I think is the final slide. Lack of reporting about the gaps in quality and transparency of primary studies. So we don't have good feedback loops that say, in this particular area, if Mo had a particular question about education and someone synthesizes that evidence, we don't have a good feedback loop to the education researchers doing the primary studies to say, here is what you'll need to do if you want to be producing primary studies that add more value to what we know about a topic. So those are examples of challenges that in the health sector had been identified before COVID. We then talk about these weaknesses, efforts to address them during COVID, but we would love to hear from anybody in the chat box. We'd love to hear from Mo. What does she see as some of the challenges in her evidence support system that she has available to her? I just have a few more slides. So the next slide, Steve, is about the other things than best evidence that were more typically encountered by COVID-19 decision makers and the risks that come along with them. So this is another way of looking at how is the evidence support system performing. We have seen in Canada and in many other countries where we have close collaborators, a lot of attention to chasing after single studies, often preprints, relying on expert opinion that is not necessarily based on best evidence, a lot of reliance on expert panels where those panelists are not supported by the best available evidence or encouraged to base their recommendations on the best evidence, and a lot of focus on jurisdictional scans where we look at other countries and say, what are they doing? And then adopting what they do, whether or not what the other countries has been shown to make a difference. So all of those things have their role, but in COVID-19 in many jurisdictions, they outweighed the best evidence. So we need to think about a better balance. If we go to the next slide, even when best evidence was brought to the table, certain forms of evidence seem to have been more typically encountered by COVID-19 decision makers. Big focus on data analytics, big focus on modeling, big focus on singles evaluation studies, less attention given to behavioral and implementation research, qualitative insights, evidence synthesis, robustly developed guidelines. And again, one of the messages that we think is likely to come out of the Evidence Commission is balance. For a given question, several forms of evidence may be relevant and they should all be brought to bear. We shouldn't just be emphasizing some to the exclusion of others that can provide value. So again, another lens on the strengths and opportunities for improvement in the evidence support system. The final slide that I'll put up before we turn it back to Mo is what for us are the most difficult exhibits that we're working on. And we're trying to describe what life is like for an NGO leader like Mo. So with Exhibit 3.4, what are the things happening in that world where evidence may or may not be used now, but there's a way in for evidence if we think about it in the right way. Similarly, on the top left-hand side, if you're Fitsum, what are the things happening in the world of government that may provide powerful ways in for research evidence, even if that's not the case now? So if any of you have feedback about how we can think about the processes that already happen in the worlds of government policymakers, organizational leaders, professionals, and citizens, that provide a potential way in for evidence, we would love to hear from you so that we can push forward these exhibits, which we're finding so difficult to finalize. On to the next slide, which I think, yeah, so let's just go back. We can stay on the previous one. Mo, can I turn it over to you? How would you describe what's going well and what could be improved in the evidence support system in Nigeria, specifically in the education sector? What's going well? How could you be better supported?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. I mean, just reflecting on what's going well. I mean, I've set the context earlier on, the context of, complexity and diversity, in this big country, called Nigeria. But what we're finding is that there is growing openness in the education sector to collaborate and partner across sectors. So there are different types of initiatives, different types of commissions, some of them actually initiated by the private sector, that are seeing greater collaboration between the state governments, the federal governments, and the non-state sector, which includes corporations. And I think that's a positive. In a few states, we've also been involved in efforts to strengthen accountability and transparency when it comes to public administration and public financing. This has been a Herculean task, but we are seeing some successes which are beginning to be replicated, across the country. With us, in the work that we do at the Education Partnership Center, we are immensely grateful that we have this community of practice that prioritizes evidence. This is the PAL network, the People's Action for Learning Network. But how many organizations have that? How many organizations can boast of that? But for us, we see this as an exemplar, for other organizations that are interested in data and value data to begin to connect with local, but also regional and international networks to promote the use of high quality data. But still there are weaknesses. One of the fundamental weaknesses that we are seeing is the lack of joined up policymaking, which at its heart is also connected to evidence. And so we know that education is a cross-sectoral concern. I mean, you can hardly speak about education, the education sector, without also talking about the Ministry of Works or the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Labor and Productivity. In fact, some would argue that education sits right at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. Certainly the Financial Times would argue that. But the question of, so whose evidence and what evidence should we prioritize? Because governments don't have, an unlimited budget, do they? I mean, neither does the private sector, but no one has an unlimited budget. So whose data, and more importantly, whose evidence, should be prioritized and when? There's also the issue around capacity and getting the right technical capacities into key functions. In order to foster this culture of evidence that I was talking about earlier on. And that continues to remain a challenge, across the country. And of course, the big elephant in the room is politics, because there is a tendency, for sound policy to be influenced by politics. And we expect this in every country of the world. But the challenge, I think the real challenge, is that there aren't sufficient accountability mechanisms that are steeped in evidence to balance this. And that's what we're finding in Nigeria as well. And so the growing appreciation, for robust, sound, high quality evidence, cannot be overstated in neutering, the power of politics to overshadow, really good and sound policy. So these are my thoughts.
Fantastic. Jeremy and Jen and I find that the more we can listen to our commissioners, the more we learn, and we're very, very committed to adapting the report drafts as we go to make sure that it captures their incredible wisdom, but also really shines a light on the great practices, but also the things that need to be improved. So thank you very, very much, Mo. We're going to move now to the Q&A, and I know that there have been questions coming in. Jeremy, you may have been keeping an eye on them. Would you be willing to field the questions?
Yep, absolutely. So again, thank you so much for the questions, and we'll get through, we hopefully should get through probably most of them. So the first is from Ayrton Steen, and I know Ayrton, and he's from Brazil, so he's a visitor to the continent, and he basically says society is facing many social dilemmas, including climate change, COVID-19 vaccine inequity access, and misinformation. How is the Global Commission on Evidence planning to tackle this complex situation, especially for effective global cooperation? So I think it's thinking about that global or multinational sort of perspective and coordination. So I don't know, either John or Mo, whether you want to go first on that.
Mo, do you have anything you want to, don't feel you need to answer every question that comes in, but Mo, did you want to add anything on this point, and then I could go?
The one thing that I will say, is that COVID-19 has shone a light on how critically important, and you mentioned this earlier, John, how critically important it is to have evidence. Now that you have evidence does not mean that it's going to be utilized. It doesn't mean that it's going to be believed. I mean, we see a lot of, vaccine denials, across the world today. But I think it still remains our responsibility to use these moments, these opportunities, some of which are really devastating in nature, like COVID-19 has been, but to use these opportunities to further build an understanding and appreciation for data and evidence. For me, that is a reflection that I have, been pondering over, I suppose, for the last 18 months.
Fantastic, very helpful. I guess my quick response would be that, we're not going to have all the solutions, but we're going to point to some of the challenges, and Ayrton's example here is a very profound one. One of the ways that we're addressing this through the report is we're analyzing all of the global commissions that have produced reports since January of 2016, so the start of the SDG era, and analyzing them according to what types of challenges do they address, what types of decision makers do they speak to, and critically, what types of evidence do they use in their own processes, and do they recommend that we use in addressing societal challenges? And to cut to the chase, it's a somewhat depressing story that they often, these global commissions of the great and the good, don't themselves use evidence, and they don't call for the systematic use of evidence in addressing societal challenges. So one of many levers available to us is to dramatically up our game in the rigor with which global commissions undertake their work, because global commissions by their nature are meant to bring together diverse players from around the globe to try to advance understanding and advance viable solutions to address collective problems. And if they are not fit for purpose, then we're not going to end up with fit for purpose recommendations. So that's one way in, but it is a big issue, Ayrton, that we're pointing to, and we'll continue to listen closely to our commissioners to see if they have additional thoughts about what concretely can be done.
I mean, from my perspective, I think one of the things that the Commission is doing is actually sort of shining a light on this as a problem. We need to work better as a global community to think about how we can provide evidence in a timely and efficient way without doing a huge amount of overlapping work, to allow sort of decision makers to think about the means of evidence in their jurisdiction. So I think the Global Commission will highlight this. We may have some suggestions about what could be done to do that. But I also see that should be the work of the work after the Commission in terms of working with different evidence producers and evidence systems and funders and governments to think about how to achieve that. I'm going to go next. There's another question in the chat box. Then there's, in the Q&A. Then there's a few things in the chat box, and then I'll come back to the Q&A. So the next question was from Andile Mondensella. Andile, I apologize if I not quite got your name right. And they say, I would like to know how the Commission approaches measuring evidence use. Is the plan to provide advice to government in designing evidence-informed decision-making index and maybe country reports on the use of evidence? So again, I think that might be more of a John question, but I don't know if John wants to go first, and then Mo, we can come to you, see if you've got anything to add.
So, great question. And this is exactly why we need to be out listening to people about what needs to be in there. There is currently a draft recommendation that the commissioners will take a look at on Friday about the need to have mechanisms to audit structures and processes that support evidence use within countries or subnational jurisdictions if it's a federal country. And to do that, ideally, one of the things that would be available would be measures of evidence use. So currently in the report, we're falling back on the usual things like, do you cite evidence in your products, government policy products and so on. But that doesn't capture the many nuanced ways in which research can help people think about problems and solutions differently. It doesn't rule out the possibility that it is what we sometimes call a political use of research. So a decision was made, and then after the fact, people look for evidence that supported the decision that had already been made. But we can certainly put in front of the commissioner the idea that targeted work is needed on acceptable metrics for evidence use as something that they might want to advocate.
Mo, do you have anything to add to that? No. All right, I think that's a very good thorough answer. So in the chat box, Alan Deve said, I work exclusively with refugees and we always find it very challenging to get refugee issues considered or mainstreamed in most countries. What would be your suggestions on getting decision makers to make sound decisions that favorably impact refugees as a population group? So again, wonderful question. I'm kind of looking at the.
Well, I can jump in quickly. That you may have heard me say that one of our early chapters is focused on equity, to lay out how equity needs to govern all aspects of how we approach the production and use of evidence. And so what that, and we then have separate exhibits that are going to focus on the unique rights and ways of knowing among Indigenous communities as an example. But refugees would be another example of a group, as you've pointed out, that are historically not well represented in data. They're not well captured in studies. They are not given attention in decision making. But by having an equity lens that flows through the entire report and that we think will be front and center in the recommendations, we hope to give much greater attention to these types of issues. So, and we specifically highlight refugees. We introduced something called the Progress Plus framework to draw attention to groups that need to be specifically considered. And refugees would be one of the groups that are included in Progress Plus. So we hope it will be, a thread running through the entire report and will come out explicitly in the recommendations. So I know I'm speaking at this point with a bit of generalization, but at the end of the day, the commissioners have to think through these issues and land on a set of recommendations. But certainly equity is likely to be a thread through the report and likely to be one in the recommendations, and refugees would be part of that conversation.
Mo, do you want to add anything to that in terms of sort of, okay, I think I'll start with you for the next one. It's coming from the chat box. You've not had a chance to read it, but I'm going to bring together two comments. One was from Lynn Edwards, and they said, one of the ways we have been moderately successful in ensuring evidence is used by policymakers and frontline providers is having them participate in research that is addressing their concern. And also, Janine Malcolm talks about the role of the catalyst and connector in evidence uptake as a soft skill, but that's often underestimated in the process. So I think this is about the relationship of the decision makers to the ongoing research process, both during and after the research. I don't know if you've got any kind of comments about how you've done this, Mo, or your experience of this from a Nigerian perspective.
For me, I think that the critical word continues to be collaboration. And so I remember, I'll use a very specific example. So when we were planning to carry out this large-scale study, we wanted to ascertain the learning levels of children across the country. We recognized immediately that there were critical stakeholders without whose input and support and buy-in, attempting to do this and having the evidence accepted would be a significant challenge. And so the very first year, I think the first 365 days were dedicated to building consensus really, and helping these different stakeholder groups understand why they needed to be part of this effort. And so whether it was the federal government or the state governments, or whether it was the Curriculum Development Agency or the National Population Commission or the National Bureau of Statistics or the civil society, anchor body, for the country, or the leading corporate sectors, it was imperative that they came on board and that we were able to collaborate, in designing these studies and these assessments, and so that the acceptance of the results would also come naturally. And that's what we've seen actually. We've seen that there's been acceptance, there's been uptake, there's a lot of referencing of the data, because this, again, I want to go back to the complexity of the Nigerian context. Trust is very difficult to build, and data is very often sensationalized. So building that collaboration, building that consensus, building that trust, I think is a critical component. And I can't help but see the sort of like the parallels with what we're trying to do here, on the Global Commission. And I think that's really just my perspective. It's collaboration, really.
Great, and actually Lawrence also in the chat box had said, again, in South Africa, they've had a lot of experience of co-production and collaboration is a very core way of engaging decision makers. I'm going to keep going because we're John, if you...
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, sorry.
We've actually got almost 20 questions now. So the next question is from Promise Nduku, and she said, how do you see the role of the Global Commission in relation to national departments tasked to support evidence use, such as the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in South Africa? Is it similar or comparable to the relationship between the UN institutions to country governments, perhaps? Go on, John, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, just good to hear from you, Promise. I haven't seen you in a while, so great to I saw your name in the chat box. Great to have the question. I think that, there's parallels, but there's also powerful complementarities. So I was being interviewed by one of your fellow country persons this morning who was talking about DPME, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and I was noting how interesting it is that they have this whole of government perspective, very similar to Fitsum's whole of government perspective with the Planning and Development Commission. And that gives them such a powerful interface with how all of government thinks about evidence, and also a powerful interface with evidence intermediaries and evidence producers. So those central roles, which the Africa Center for Evidence has such experience in supporting, is something that I think all of us can learn from. So many of us are focused on line ministries, like ministries of health, and we don't think about that central government apparatus. But you're right that there's an analog in the UN systems where the UN and its specialized agencies support governments as well with that kind of whole of government perspective. So I think there are powerful connections there, and the current draft of many of the Evidence Commission's exhibits speak specifically to these central government entities, but in much more detail to the UN system, and how the UN system is doing some things very well, but if it's really going to support government policy making, it needs to dramatically up its game in using evidence in its own work. So I think one of our big challenges ahead is pushing for change in the UN system to give much greater attention to evidence, given their key role in supporting governments.
So I'm going to do to chair this and move on because we've got very little time. I'm going to jump, Lawrence, I'm afraid I'm going to jump over your question to Michael Glick's question, which was talking about some of the issues I think Mo highlighted, that in her country there are many, many different linguistic groups, but understanding and interpreting evidence in it is very language specific. How does the Commission plan to, if at all, deal with language translations in a continent with hundreds of different languages? And Mo, I think that sounds like it's a good question for you.
I mean, just to say in 30 seconds that one of the things that drew me to the Commission, was the dedication to ensuring that evidence is understood. And so the mix of exhibits, particularly the use of infographics, I think is critical in helping very busy policymakers, very busy decision makers understand quite quickly, what it is that we're trying to say. Of course, the issues of translation must be prioritized, in a multicultural, multi-ethnic or multilinguistic context. But I think that just a commitment to visual representation represents a leap forward. And I haven't seen that done very, very well in a lot of other spaces, I have to say.
And I would just add, we are committed to get the report out in 6 languages, but we are going to make the infographics available in an adaptable form. So if someone wanted to put it into any other language, they're very, very welcome to do it. So it's all being put into the public domain, and we encourage people to translate it into local languages if you find any of those infographics helpful.
So I think we have to draw this to an end, and I apologize because we have Nazreen, Lawrence, and Isaiah, who we've not been able to get to your questions, and they're really, well, Nazreen had a hand up. They're really interesting. What I'm going to suggest is that if you can email us, we'll try and respond to your questions after this as well. So I think this is a wonderful first global discussion of the Commission, and it's been great to have you with us, and it's really wonderful that Mo and Fitsum were able to spend time with us and actually also describe their passion for this area, which is just great to see. So one of the things we'd like you to do is to help us get the message out. We've established a website, and that's going to be where we put everything. There's already a lot of information there. The draft exhibits are there, so we'd love it if you could go regularly to that and give us feedback. This doesn't fit for me, or this language isn't quite right, or you're forgetting about this. We have literally, I think in the last 24 hours, just pushed out the first Evidence Commission newsletter, so you can sign up on the website for that. We're on Twitter, and I'll give you all of our communication channels at the end. We're on LinkedIn, and basically, please feel free to use any of the materials of the Commission to start conversations in your community, in your sector, and help us once the Commission's work is done to kind of continue those discussions to basically argue that we need a better global and national and regional system to help people, whoever they are, make better decisions. So Steve, can we have the last slide? Oh, the next slide. Yeah, the last one. So these are our and I'll leave this up, but these are our sort of links. If you search on Evidence Commission, you should very quickly find us. But please feel free, and again for Lawrence, Isaiah, and Nazreen, please send us just by email what your queries are. We'll try and pick them up, but we don't have your reply address, and we'll follow up with you afterwards. Follow us on Twitter, retweet us to your worlds and your communities. If you're on LinkedIn, again, please do that. But it's been a really great session. Thank you so much to Mo. Thank you to Ruth and the conference organizers. And from John and Jen and myself, we look forward to further discussions with you all in the near future. Thank you very much.